Welcome to our second Scaling Nonprofit event in 2025. Scaling Nonprofits provides nonprofits access to advisors to gain the advice and guidance you need for growth and sustainability. We collaborate with executive directors, boards, and management who care about growing strategically to scale your impact and improve your bottom line. Start with an advisory call for pro bono advice. Our primary sponsor is the Financial Executives International Boston chapter. FEI is a leading association comprised of members who hold positions as chief financial officers, chief accounting officers, controllers, treasurers, and tax executives at companies in every major industry. Our nonprofit and social enterprise sponsor is Amalgamated Bank. Amalgamated is America's socially responsible bank, empowering organizations and individuals to advance positive social change. This is our fourth event with the bank since 2019. We collaborate with Kathy Gasparini, who is the first Vice President Social Impact Banking at the Boston Bank location. Our first media sponsor is the Mass Nonprofit Network. They are the voice of the nonprofit sector in Massachusetts, a statewide organization that brings together all parts of the nonprofit ecosystem. From nonprofits to funders, community and business leaders, and elected officials to help nonprofits grow and raise the sector's voice on critical issues. We partner with Claire Ladd at MNN. Our second media sponsor is the Nonprofit Center of the Berkshires. Leanna Toscanini, the executive director, started NPC in 2016 to serve as the clearinghouse for information for nonprofits. They continue to be a vital resource for the community. We lived in Stockbridge for 6 years, and NPC was a real common element for nonprofit success. Our speaker today is Warren Tranquada. He is president and CEO of the AT&T Performing Arts Center in the heart of the Dallas Arts District. On its 10-acre campus, the center hosts 3 performance venues: Winspear Opera House, Wiley Theater, and Strauss Square. Prior to this role, he served as EVP and COO at the New Jersey Performing Arts Center in Newark, where he led strategic planning and operations for the organization and its $50 million annual budget. Welcome, Warren, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Good afternoon to everyone, or good morning to those of you on Central, Mountain, or Pacific time. Our topic today is strategic pivots in times of change. Just a couple of quick logistics. We had a lot of people RSVP for the call, about 85. So there's a lot of content to cover. I ask that if you've got questions or comments that we primarily use chat, and we're going to try to hold most of those until the end of the presentation. Certainly, please do use that chat function. If there's something that really has to be said in the moment, then use the raise your hand function in Zoom. I know we've all been on Zoom for 5 years, but they changed it recently. You have to hit the reaction button, and then you'll be able to see raise hand. And if you do that, then I'll call on you right away. But otherwise, let's use the chat to try to stay connected. So our topic today is change, and certainly we are in a time of unprecedented change. Actually, when we started planning the session in the fall, pre-election, our original vision was to take a look at how the response that nonprofits made during the COVID period could be a case study for how to generally respond to some future undefined period of change. But of course, as we got closer to the date, we recognized that we are in a period of rapid change right now, and these issues have been dominating discussions at many of our offices. And there is a lot going on today. I tried to put together a list of some of the things that may be impacting our organizations. This is a partial list. And even if we take aside the changes going on in Washington, it's hard to put those aside, but even if we take those aside, this is a pretty interesting transition point. Just take the first item on here, artificial intelligence. There's no question that AI is going to substantially change delivery models, our relationship with our employees, our relationships with our constituents, and it's very hard to figure out what that is going to mean. So I'm sure that at some point in the future, if it's not already happening, the impact of AI on your organizations is going to be an important part of conversation for strategy. And of course, as you look over this list, there's a lot of other things going on. In my world in performing arts, audiences have changed their behavior substantially post-COVID, climate change having a huge impact. And in just the course of the last few months, it's interesting how, if we look back 2 years ago, policies on DEI and inclusion were very much a required factor to manage your relationship with employees. It was being demanded of funders, being demanded of employees, and now at this point, DEI may be considered a liability in some organizations. So there's obviously rapid change. Yet at the same time, as stressful as this moment is, I would argue there's nothing new about rapid change. And I made a list of a few things that have happened, in the last 100 years, and you'll see actually a whole bunch of them were in the last 15 years. Just in the last 15 years, we had the COVID-19 shutdown, and I can't think of another period of such rapid change than that we all lived through. We also lived through the introduction of the smartphone and how that changed the relationships, changing attitudes toward to work-life balance, to in-person and remote work, supply chain disruptions, the internet. I mean, we've seen substantial rapid change. And so I get back to the original idea. Let's look at how we've responded to some of these changes in the past and use that as a guidepost for how we look at change in the future. So the theme is really how to be strategic and thoughtful rather than chaotic when dealing with significant change. Personally, I like the two quotes that are on this slide, and I'll just share them with you now. The proverb at the bottom, I think that's instructive. When the winds of change blow, some people build walls, others build windmills. And if we look back over history in any period of rapid change, there's been organizations and companies that embrace that change, and they usually outperform those that try to deny that it's happening or try to stop it from happening. We could look at Blockbuster and Netflix as one example from the for-profit world, but certainly throughout business and nonprofits, there's plenty of examples of embracing change as a strategic advantage. The quote from Treater Drucker also leans on that theme. While turbulence is dangerous, what's even more dangerous is to deny that is happening. Before we dig into the formal content, I'm just going to share a little bit about my background so you'll understand where my perspective comes from, and also want to be clear about what biases or blinders I'm going to be bringing to this topic. I started my career in business strategy at Bain & Company and later Chase. And when I transitioned in the nonprofit sector about 25 years ago, my work was primarily based on business planning, strategic planning, and earned income development. The early work I did was cross-sector, mostly in mid-sized organizations with budgets $5 to $30 million. Since 2009, I've been exclusively in the performing arts world at two relatively large venues. Currently, I'm at the AT&T Performing Arts Center in Dallas. So I'm going to acknowledge up front my experiences have been primarily at mid-sized and larger nonprofits with significant earned income components in their business plan. I've tried to make these slides relevant to any organization, but if at any point you feel like the comments may be a little bit biased towards larger organizations or heavy earned income organizations, definitely drop a note and we'll try to reframe to make sure it's relevant to you. So that's a little bit about my background. I invite you in the chat to say a little bit about yourself. We've got too many people to do around the Zoom screen, but I encourage you to just drop a quick note in the chat saying what organization you're with, and if it's not obvious, what sector it's in, and we'll try to use that as we go to guide our conversations. All right, so now the content itself. So we're going to focus on 4 areas today. One, we're going to have a short conversation about identifying the nature of change, and I think that's important because it does impact understanding what change is happening has an impact on your response. We're going to talk about tools that can be used during the good times to be prepared for when change happens. And then we'll get into the heart of this, what to do when you're actually in a crisis situation and change is having a significant impact on your organization. And then finally, we'll end with a few pitfalls before we open it for general conversation. I'm going to speak for about 70 minutes or so, and then we'll have a wide open conversation. But again, at any point, leave questions in the chat or raise your hand if you want to jump in. So first, starting with types of change. So my argument is that it's important to classify change if you're going to be thoughtful about figuring out how to respond. And I think there's 4 different versions of change that demand different responses. The most common, and I would argue the most dangerous, is what I would call a slow burn. I say it's dangerous because it's really easy to miss that it's happening until it's too late. And again, I would point to Blockbuster Video as kind of the obvious example of not being aware that change was happening. In my sector, audience behavior is a real big change that's happening right now. It's been happening for about 10 years. COVID accelerated it, but it has been a slow change. And there's even now, 15 years into this change, there's organizations that are denying that it's happening or waiting for it to stop. The second type, which I think is easier to recognize, is what we can call the short-term crisis. There's a recession. There's been a change in government funding. Of course, the COVID shutdowns. And the key difference here is change happens quickly, and importantly, it's understood that the change is temporary. And here, the biggest trick, I think, is being able to diagnose, is this a temporary change or is it a permanent change? But knowing that something is temporary, I think, has a different way of response than something that is a permanent change. Compare that with that third type, a permanent shock. It happens quickly and you know it's not going to be temporary. So an example could be a funder, your major funder saying you're no longer within their guidelines, or regulatory change that makes the way you deliver service no longer feasible. And finally, and rarest of all, is what I'll call the existential threat. Most commonly, this is a threat from government about your very existence, and we're certainly seeing this right now in federal government agencies and the NGOs that they support. But my favorite classic example is the March of Dimes, which was created to cure polio, and it did. And then the question is, well, does this organization still have a role if polio is no longer a threat? So I talked about 4 changes. Let's talk about how those how the solution is different. In the case of a slow burn, I would argue that that requires a change in business model, but you also have the luxury of time to invest and wean yourself off of your old business model. Compare that to a short-term crisis. It's a temporary issue. The goal is protect the core of the organization quickly and be prepared to rebound. A permanent shock requires fast action and a solution that will endure. And again, that's the big difference between that permanent shock and the short-term crisis. Permanent shock, you need a new business model quickly, a new vision quickly, whereas a short-term crisis, you just need to know how to carry yourself until the end of that crisis. And then obviously with an existential question, you need a full assessment about your purpose, vision, and even whether you should continue to exist. So a couple of examples here on the slow burn. I'll use audience change in performing arts as my example. To address that core challenge of audiences coming less frequently, one of the strategies that's been successful has been to diversify and grow audiences. And that's a pretty big sea change from what was typical in the early 2000s in my industry, which was to focus on loyalty and repeat business and really overserve the frequent customer. Knowing the frequent customer is no longer a frequent customer has necessitated this diversification of audience. Short-term crisis, an example, of course, COVID is the most obvious. We all lived through that. An example of a strong targeted response was organizations that changed their delivery models to virtual quickly to be able to serve their constituents, keep people employed. The organization I was at the time, NJPAC, and I saw Mary Jaffa on the call, and Jeff Jacob, who were both there. We had been talking about distance learning for 10 years without much traction. COVID hit, we implemented a distance learning program within 10 days, and it allowed us to serve our constituents, continue to raise money, deliver value, keep staff on the payroll. It wasn't the only viable response, of course. Some organizations chose to stop delivery and figure out how to minimize expenses to save resources for the recovery. Long-term change, the immediate and permanent shock, a strategy that works well, could be a mini campaign that is a bridge fund to implement that new model. The key here that has separated successful organizations is having a vision for what the other side is. So it's not a desperation fund, it's raising a fund that gets you to that new vision. And then finally, if we look at existential, I'll go back to the March of Dimes. March of Dimes still exists today, but has a new purpose. And interestingly, in the United States, the mission of March of Dimes is to improve the health of mothers and babies with a special interest in preventing birth defects. In Canada, where I'm originally from, there's a March of Dimes there too that was also created to end polio, and they changed their mission to provide services to people with disabilities, primarily adults. So two very different responses, but both of them effectively were able to say, do we have a way to take this fundraising network we've had and apply it to some good use that is consistent with our founding idea, even when the disease doesn't exist anymore. So that's the first section there. I would love to see in the chat if there's any threat that you're particularly concerned about right now, and particular if we go back to that list of types of change. If you want to put in what type of change you're facing, happy to just take a quick look at any of those that pop up. I'm not seeing any come up in the chat right now. Feel free to keep adding them later, but we'll move on to our next section then. So this is going to be one of the two larger sections, tools to be prepared for the long term. I really want to speak about the things that you could do before you're in a crisis. This is about building robust organizations that can withstand drastic change. My perspective on this section is certainly shaped by how I observed organizations get through COVID and the tactics that worked and the things that allowed organizations to be successful. In my experience, organizations that use some of the tools I'm about to go through were much better equipped to deal with that sudden shock of having to close in a matter of hours and redesign their models. So the number one tool, and this should be obvious, especially given the title of the presentation, is to have a clear strategic plan. If there's nothing else you take from today, take that having a good strategic plan prepares you for the future. I know that's kind of an obvious statement to make, but I'm gonna dig into it a little bit more. Having that plan gives you the framework in which to make difficult decisions. So I'm not suggesting that you should have a strategic plan that has in it, here's what our tactics will be if we happen to lose all of our funding, or the government changes its regulations, or AI changes our model. Really, the point is having clarity around vision, purpose, mission, values, and your priorities for the next 5 years. If you've got that clear, when you have to make difficult decisions, you've got something to go back to that helps you make sure that cuts make sense and that you're remembering why you do the work that you're doing. It's really that test point to say, all right, if what we're trying to do is address this problem, how do we address this problem in this new context? If we have certain priorities, how do we make sure we don't cut the things that are going to advance those priorities? Mission, purpose, vision, values, those are things that should not change much over time, even in the midst of a crisis. The strategic priorities become the guide when you're in crisis, and the goals, those can be, those annual goals can change easily. Those can be very fluid, but the upper part of this is really the most important. So a clean clear strategic plan is always going to be helpful when you have to deal with a significant crisis. I know that's kind of an obvious statement. A second obvious statement is that working over time to diversify your sources of revenue provides much more stability when something is going wrong with one of those sources. The wider the range of sources of income in your model, the better prepared you can be. On the contributed side, I would encourage every organization to reduce their reliance on their largest donors. That's a vulnerable position, and certainly I've seen too many organizations enjoy the luxury of having a single funder that's 60% of their model, and suddenly that gets threatened and their existence is called into question. So as wonderful as it is, it makes you vulnerable. Endowment is another really strong way to diversify funding. Well-structured endowment continues to pay regardless of what's happening in the world. And ideally, if you've got a long enough look back period, regardless of what's happening in the business cycle. And an endowment also provides a lot of comfort in that it can be transferred to a successor organization to continue your mission if you go insolvent. And I know no one wants to think about their future insolvency, but a strong endowment can outlast even the organization itself. On the earned side, there's a few things to consider. The most common way to diversify earned income is to develop related businesses. So, for example, in my field of performing arts, food services, parking, premium experiences, facility rentals. Similarly, there can be opportunities to price what you offer on an earned basis to match market using subsidies to provide access. The most common example here are what universities do, and as frustrating as it is, I'm sure to everyone on this call, universities have figured out that they should price their tuition based on the value that they're delivering to those who are able to pay, and then use scholarships, financial aid, and other subsidies to bring that cost down so that those who can't pay that market price can still access it. It's certainly, I think, a strong balance, and I think many of us I think many of us in nonprofits undercharge for what we do because of that feeling of, look, we're nonprofits. We need to charge less than the for-profit sector. I would argue one of the strongest ways to diversify your earned income is to price to market and then use some program to provide accessibility as an alternative. Some of the more obscure ways to improve the diversification of revenue is to monetize some asset. And there's really two ways. One is selling something outright, like real estate. That's the most obvious. That can be turning real estate into an endowment instead of a liability. Could be a powerful way to build diversification, especially if you have excess real estate that you don't actually need for your mission, or just monetizing a strength that you have in an unrelated market. I'll give an example. The Network for Teaching Entrepreneurship, an organization I worked with in the early 2000s, they had developed a curriculum that they used in their classroom work that was a pretty powerful business curriculum. And they realized that they could sell that textbook to Pearson Publishing. They spun off the textbook as a different division to make money selling the textbook as a business guide separate from their work that they were doing in schools. So for schools they weren't working with, they could still drive some earned income. A quick note on earned income, and this is not a session on building earned income business plans, and I know John has sessions like that he does from time to time, but I do want to share a few quick best practices. And I think the biggest point I want to make here is that if you're going to develop an earned income business strategy, you need to think of it just like a regular for-profit business does. Are you meeting a customer need? Do you have a competitive advantage? Are people willing to pay for that? Sustainable earned income businesses have to be competitive with the for-profit world. If you're not competitive, you are really just fundraising and putting on the liability of giving away a product. When you attach a price, your audience acts like a consumer, whether that is for something related like parking or anything else, you have to be competitive with your neighbors. And the example I always like to talk about here is Girl Scout cookies. Girl Scout cookies, yes, it's a fundraising tool, but Girl Scout cookies are really good. And there are people that seek out girls at their local shopping center or their friends who have young women in their lives to try to buy cookies. It's very different from what I think PTAs often do with fundraising. When the PTA has a buy a stupid candle you don't need fundraiser, it's not really earned income. You're just asking people for donation and giving them a free candle. That's not really a sustainable business. What's amazing about Girl Scout cookies is that they are fully competitive with what's being offered in the supermarket, and they're serving a customer need in a market. The fact that it's benefiting young women's leadership is almost a side effect of it. All right, moving on from revenue diversification, I want to talk briefly about reserve funds. And this is another strong strategy for being prepared for the future. Investing to build a strong balance sheet. Certainly during COVID, this was the game changer, I think, for many organizations. This does not just happen. It has to be intentional, usually either part of a capital campaign to build reserve funds or the result of a policy on how to use surpluses, or even a policy that it is okay for the organization to have surpluses. Following COVID, what was interesting to me, a lot of the government aid for COVID came in after the war was already won. The Shuttered Venue Operating Grant is a good example of that, and the earned or the Employee Retention Tax Credit. Most people got their ERTC long after their business had actually recovered. And I think the strongest organizations took those one-time windfalls and instead of spending them on current needs, put them towards reserves for a future crisis. And certainly those that did that are much better prepared for what's happening right now. I would make the same argument with estate gifts, legal settlements, or really any windfall. If a windfall comes in, I would argue you should look first at reserve funds rather than looking at a current use for those money, particularly if it's material in size. They can take several forms, and I would encourage organizations to use as many of these forms as possible and explicitly segment what those reserves are for. That intentionality, I think, helps create the discipline for the board in deciding how to use those. You can always reclassify if you get that balance wrong, with the exception of endowment, but all the other sources you can reclassify. I think it shows an intentionality and ensures some discipline. If you're going to use a cash reserve to fund a deficit, knowing how much you've already said you could use for that purpose versus your capital reserve, I think helps the organization be thoughtful about how it uses those funds. Other forms of reserve, of course, endowment, capital, cash. The difference with board designation, to me, cash reserve is a reserve that's there so that if you have a deficit, you can get through the year, versus board designated, which would be a very intentional use, actually budgeting for a deficit. And then investment is funds that you could use to purchase a piece of real estate or to invest in an earned income idea to bring it to fruition, or even to partially subsidize a program that has a long-term funding role but may have a short-term investment requirement. Keeping along this theme of things to prepare in advance, I would argue that while times are good, is a great time to do research on the impact that your organization has. And it may seem like an unneeded luxury if your donors are not asking for it, but I think having good data on impact prepares for you when you might be threatened down the road. Impact, of course, takes a lot of forms. I've got a few of them listed here, from economic growth, employment, tax base, educational outcomes, social emotional growth, health and well-being, environmental. I would encourage you to think about the economic piece in any kind of impact research that you're doing. When push comes to shove, economic arguments are very powerful for politicians. And it's good to have those in the background. Even if your primary output is social and emotional growth, having a connection between how social and emotional growth builds tax base or lowers government expenses is useful to have. I noticed a comment here, Kathleen, about promoting peaceful living and upliftment of the human spirit through the arts, philosophies, and science. Um, a great mission, and obviously, I think it would be valuable in tying it to this slide in particular to understand, okay, what does that mean for society? Can we put some meat behind why peaceful living and the human spirit are good for communities. And I think there's a lot of great arguments that could be made there, and it's good to have those in advance of when you need them. The last tool that I'm going to share is portfolio analysis. So if you are an organization that has multiple programs, one of the things I really encourage is to periodically evaluate every program that you offer against two metrics. How well does it fit with your strategic priorities, your mission, your vision? Ideally scored on some type of rubric that you create to relatively rate the programs for impact. And secondly, what's the financial burden of this program? Ideally measured in some form like how much money do you need to raise of contributed income for every person that gets served through this program. It's not perfect, especially when you've got programs that have different types of outcomes. But if even if it's very kind of broad, this program has more impact than this program, this costs more than this program, being able to rate on these two areas is a useful tool to understand how you might think about investment and priorities going forward, and especially if you're in a point of needing to cut, what might be expendable. I think the categories here are somewhat self-explanatory, but obviously, in this green section, if you've got something that is delivering strong outcomes and is low cost, obviously that should be a priority. And equally obviously, the first place you ought to be looking when times are tough are those programs that cost a lot and don't deliver as much impact. That's the easy part. I think the yellow and the blue are much more interesting. If you've got something that is a financial contributor, but doesn't have a whole lot of impact, and I think we all know these types of programs, then the way you should evaluate it is on money. If you're, to be crass, if you're selling out, then measure it as a sellout program. And I think sometimes we get into a trap of we fund a program that we know is not quite as strong, but there's a good financial case here. We've got a donor that really likes it. Maybe there's an earned income piece to it. Maybe it's helping subsidize a program that we like better. That's great. But then sometimes that funder goes away or the pricing changes. I can think about a program, there was a rental client, I won't use their name, but there was a rental client we had here at the center that we didn't really like what they were doing on our stage. We didn't think it reflected our brand well, but we made good money from it. But over time, through negotiation, we realized the profit was going down and down and down, and we could make more money doing something else. And at that point, we said, we need, if we're going to do this program for the money, it better deliver on that money piece. The other interesting piece to me are these ones over here in the blue. Evaluate for mission return on investment, right? It's delivering huge impact and it's expensive. That's kind of why we do the things over here in order to fund what's happening down here. I think when we have programs like this, it's worth asking the question, is there a way for us to improve the finances and move it up? Or is there something we can do that can subsidize this since we realize it has strong impact, even though it's not a great moneymaker? So yeah, I think this is as a framework, I like this concept. And it sounds esoteric. I've done this probably 2 dozen times with organizations of trying to plot, and it always leads to interesting conversations. When you do this, it should not be considered gospel. There's no metric that is perfect for measuring impact. There's no metric that's perfect for measuring financial burden. So it's always intended to be indicative, but it leads to really interesting conversations. And again, doing this before you're in crisis is valuable. You can also doing it during a crisis, but especially before, I think it can give you a lot of tools to be ready. So we're maybe a couple minutes ahead. I'd be happy before I get to the next section on navigating a crisis. If there's any questions on what we've gone through right now, if anyone wants to raise their hand, I can take 2 or 3 minutes of questions before we go into the next section. I'm not seeing any hands, so we'll keep plowing through. Feel free to use the chat as well to share questions, and also if there's some ideas that worked well in your organization that I didn't talk about, I think we'd all benefit if you plopped into the chat the tools that you've been using. All right, we're going to spend the next 25 minutes or so on navigating a crisis. So now we're at the point where something is going wrong. What are some of the tools? How do we use the tools? How do we make these tough decisions? And I'm going to go back to the slide I started the last section with. More than anything else, start with your strategic plan. If you've clearly stated what's important in the long term, you have a guidepost for the short term, a framework for making those tough decisions. So more than anything else, I hope that's a takeaway here. And in doing so, again, we talked about this in the last section, but if you're making tough cuts, ask yourself, does this change? How does this change how we are addressing our mission? If there's a threat from government, what does that threat mean for how we have to address this mission? Sometimes our mission, or sometimes our purpose may stay the same, but our mission could evolve. So the problem still exists because of a change in regulation. Maybe we can't address it the same way. Is there a different way we can address it that we can take our resources and skills towards solving the problem from a different angle? If it's more of a short-term issue, what is most important in the next 5 years for us? Let's use that as our frame for deciding what we keep and what we cut. So if nothing else, that's what I hope we take away. So some of the questions you might ask. If we take this proposed action, does it have an impact on our vision, mission, priorities? Are we doing enough to invest in the priorities we set out? Do we need to change our priorities because of this crisis? Has the crisis actually changed our vision or mission? Again, this would be pretty unusual, but it could be a question to ask. Is there a different delivery model that allows us to continue to address the vision if our historic way no longer makes sense? And obviously, COVID was probably the best example of that, where many of us, I mean, certainly in the performing arts, but for many of us, we couldn't serve people in person. We had to reassess, what does our organization mean if people cannot come and see us in our offices? Inevitably, in a crisis, we get to expense cutting. So I know we've all been through this. Unfortunately, the last 5 years, I know we've probably all been through it a lot. Some of it have to go through this every single year as we do our budget. So I'm not going to dwell on it because I suspect we're all experts on it. But a couple of my thoughts on what best practices. And most important to me is to understand how your organization creates value for the community, and how it creates value for any earned income customers that you have, and try to avoid cuts that get to value. To me, value creation drives revenue, whether we're talking contributed income or earned income. And if you start cutting value, you could start what I call a death spiral, where you've cut value, so revenue falls, so then you have to cut more value, and then revenue falls again. The mission money matrix I talked about in the last section, that's a great way to plan, to challenge, okay, if we are going to have to cut some programmatic meat, where are we getting a social return on our investment? Where's our impact relative to our cost the highest? Let's make sure that we avoid cutting those areas, maybe even invest more in those areas as we're cutting others. One thing I think we all experienced in COVID, I like this expression, don't waste a good crisis. If you've got to cut costs anyways, use this as the excuse to touch the things that are untouchable. So challenge the sacred cows, terminate poor performing employees, reopen contracts that have been unfavorable. You've got an excuse, so use it to create long-term benefits beyond the cost savings you're looking for. My point on contingencies, I think we all know the temptation to pad budgets. If you're cutting and those cuts are going to lead to staff reductions and other things that hurt, make sure that you've gotten rid of the unnecessary padding. And obviously, a little contingency is always a good thing. But we all know, we probably all work with people who continually come in under budget every year because they keep putting just in case money in there. And you have to challenge all that. And I suspect many of us have challenged that a lot in the last few years. There might not be much less. This is an obvious statement, but be cautious about the impact of staff and who will remain and who is going to need to build the organization after the crisis. I think of a peer organization that I work with recently that had to lay off a substantial number of employees. It was big, it was jarring. And after they did that and said they were done, a whole bunch of other people quit. And suddenly the organization was really caught in a lurch where they had a plan, but couldn't execute on that plan because they lost the people that left behind. So treating people well and being aware of what the impact's going to be is really essential. I mean, obviously, if you have to make major cuts, you can't not look at staff. But the more disciplined you can be there, the better to be prepared for the future. And then the final point I'll make here is to be clear with your staff and donors, both about why the changes are needed, what the process will be, and what happens afterwards. I would argue you need to be decisive, move fast, and then state that the cuts are over. Uncertainty is a cloud that hangs over organizations. You want to take your medicine, make your announcement, and then be able to say, we are done, we are prepared for the future, and here's what the future looks like and why this future is exciting. Shared services. Actually, before we started the call, we were talking a little bit about a shared services 401k plan in Massachusetts, which was an interesting conversation. But often in crisis, there's a pressure, especially from donors from the for-profit world, to find savings through shared services. And certainly, I think it's a great opportunity to open the door to conversations that haven't been had before. And for those who aren't familiar with the term, shared services is just, it's pretty much what it says. Multiple organizations working together and sharing some costs that they can both use. And an example could be a shared employee benefit program or a shared sales force or a ticketing system that is being used by multiple organizations. So certainly it's encouraging to use a crisis to open those doors, but I want to be cautious. Shared services are rarely a short-term win. It is a long-term game. In fact, often they lead to incremental costs in the short term until they have matured. And in many cases, the benefit of shared services are more about quality and access than actual hard savings. Especially when you're dealing with small organizations sharing with other small organizations. You could have small organizations share to create a joint health plan or benefit program. But if the organizations didn't have a health plan before, they're not going to save money. They'll be less expensive than if they had to create it on their own, but they're still adding costs. There's no magic bullet that sharing services suddenly makes healthcare affordable in this country. So I give that caution that it's important to set expectations with donors. Donors love this. There's a lot of donors that get very excited about, oh, we've got, 4 organizations with the same mission. Why do each of them have a CFO? Let's just have one CFO serving the 4 organizations. Great idea in theory, and practice is very hard to realize that, and it's not going to lead to savings in the short term. But getting back to my earlier point, not wasting a crisis, there is long-term value, so it could start the conversation, but it's not likely to be how you get out of the crisis. As you start working on budgets in a period of crisis, I would encourage a lot of scenario planning in that moment. How long is this going to last? How bad could it last? What's likely, but also what is worst case? I think in COVID, we were all a little surprised at how worst case was. Um, I remember in my organization, we started with a 1 month plan, a 3 month plan, and a 6 month plan. And our board chair said, why don't you try an 18-month plan and see what that looks like? And our initial reaction was like, oh, you've got to be crazy. How could we possibly be shut down for 18 months? And of course, in reality, we were shut down for 18 months. And it was longer than that before things returned to something resembling normal. So I think scenario planning is very important to do. As we think about scenario planning, you want to understand, okay, what is unlikely but possible, and do we have a plan that could sustain that? Doesn't mean that you have to implement that plan, but you might want to reserve a portion of your reserves for that doomsday scenario. You have a plan that makes sense with one scenario and know that you've got the assets if it's worse than what you're expecting. So you don't want to foreclose that worst case option, even if the plan you're implementing is the most likely option. So I think this is a very powerful tool. And again, I think we all went through COVID and remember what we had to do to get through that. And I think scenario planning was in many ways the difference between organizations that were able to really thrive during COVID and those that sputtered out. As you work through a crisis, another really important best practice to me is to think about what happens when that crisis has passed. Two things in particular really stick out to me. Treat the staff that remain well. Make sure that you have enough institutional memory in place for the recovery. And secondly, know what that recovery looks like. Create a business plan for the post-crisis world. Now, again, this gets back to understanding the type of change, right? If we're in a short-term change that has an end, that post-crisis world might look like exactly like the pre-crisis world. Great, that's pretty easy to business plan, but at least know what that looks like. If you're in more of the slow burn period or the immediate and permanent change, you've got to be able to articulate what that business model looks like after the crisis. This is really critical in my mind. And it plays into a couple of the other comments I'm going to make in a few minutes about how to use reserve funds, how to work with donors in the midst of a crisis. But knowing what you look like after the crisis is just as important as knowing what things look like during the crisis itself. So now let's talk about reserve funds. In the last section, we talked about building reserves was a good way to be ready for a crisis. And to that point, it's perfectly reasonable when a crisis hits to use those reserve funds to sustain the organization and reduce the need to be draconian in cuts. That's why you built the reserves in the first place. So if you've got a strong balance sheet, that is reasonable. But there's some really, really big caveats. Having a reserve is not an excuse for running a bloated budget when times are poor. Really, reserves should be the last piece of the puzzle after making responsible cuts. So you can do this before you make draconian cuts, but at the least you should be making some effort before you go to your reserve funds. The second point, and I think the most important, is anytime you use reserve funds, there's got to be an end in sight. I would argue if you have to tap reserves for more than 18 months, you've institutionalized their use. And that is a path to gutting your reserve fund. So there has to be a very clear time frame and a vision for what happens that allows you to stop using the reserves. If you can't articulate the conditions that mean you won't need to use the reserves anymore, you probably shouldn't be using them in the first place. If you've used reserves for 24 months or longer, you're in a new normal, and that's going to be problematic. A little different than reserves is something I'll call a bridge fund. And it could be used in addition to reserves or instead of reserves, or if your organization doesn't have sufficient reserves. This means going to some donors, particularly close-in donors, with an emergency campaign to bridge the crisis. And obviously, this was very common during COVID, and not unusual when an organization is in a cash crunch. Go to your close-in donors and ask for a bridge. It can be very compelling, and it can be very necessary way to get through a crisis. But like with reserves, there's some challenges here as well. Best practice to me is that if you're going to do a bridge fund, do it once. You've got one shot. Annual emergency campaigns get tired very quickly. I think we've all seen these. Donors get tired. It hurts donor confidence. It can stagnate growth. You don't want to be doing special emergency funds every single year. So to me, that means, again, goes back to this point. What is the plan for how you get through this and what it looks like when the crisis is over? Raise enough in your bridge fund to get you to the point of sustainability. I'll give an example. An organization I did some work with found itself in a period of institutional deficits. It was losing money every year. A new CEO came in and decided to create a bridge fund, but accompanied with it with a very clear business plan. The CEO laid out this vision that said, in 3 years, we can grow our earned income and our contributed income through these strategies. And when we do that, we will have a sustainable business model. But to get there, we've got a gap. That gap will involve cutting our deficit in half in year 1, cutting it in half again in year 2. In year 3, there will be no deficit. So we need to fund that year and a half of deficits. We also have to fund rebuilding the deficits, so an equal amount for rebuild, and we have to fund an equal amount for investment funds to invest in the strategies that are going to get us to sustainability. So some expenses we're going to have to incur that get us there. It was a really successful plan. In fact, the deficit was eliminated in 18 months instead of 2 years. It was a credible plan. It was especially credible because that organization beat its budget goal in year 1. It still needed to use that bridge fund, but it beat the goal, so it gained a lot of credibility with donors. So to me, that's how a bridge fund ought to look. It can't just be every year, we need a bridge because this is a tough year, but don't worry, audiences will come back, or the recession is going to end, or we just need the Democrats to win, and then our government funding will be restored. You've got to have a really clear path that's credible, and do it once. Government advocacy, of course, can often be a compelling route to getting through a crisis as well. And in COVID, this turned out to be critical. Of course, PPP in my sector, the Shuttered Venues Operator Grant, ERTC, these were all really important ways organizations that were in a special crisis got through. A couple of thoughts on effective targeted advocacy in a crisis. To the extent possible, I would encourage collaborating cross-sector. The Shuttered Venue Operators Grant was a really great example. There were for-profit venue operators and nonprofit venue operators operating together. And the argument was one of value creation and economic impact. So this was a bipartisan support bill for live arts, but it wasn't framed as in live arts are important because we need to save opera. It was framed in music venues, both for-profit and nonprofit, are lifebloods in community and employ a lot of people, generate a lot of tourism dollars, keep communities vibrant. And that economic argument really helped drive that point home. And the for-profit partners in that were really important. Again, economic and value creation. I talked about this when we talked about impact research, but if government is in trouble as well because of a bad economy, being able to show that this will help government by avoiding large layoffs and keeping the sector going might be a stronger argument than just talking about why these things are good for society. Asks have to be clear, and then the last point I'll make here is to read legislation very carefully. Legislation takes on a world of its own once it gets in lawmaker hands, and there's a lot of lobbyists that are whispering in ears, and it's really important to read. So just to give you an example on the shuttered venue operating grant, when we looked at that legislation when it was in the draft form, we realized there was one word that was the difference between whether our organization would get $7 million or zero. And that word was total. If it talked about total income versus earned income, that was a difference of whether we would be eligible or not. Knowing that, we went to our peers who could be in the same position, got a block together, and reached out to Schumer's office and said, "This is a word that's really important because of this particular situation." And we were able to get that changed, and of course, it was a very successful program. But don't take your lobbyist words for it. Read the language of bills really carefully to make sure that it's actually doing what it says it will. And I've seen so many examples of that. Again, bills take on lives of their own. You can have a legislator say, "I'm on your side. I'll write something," and just like one of those little nuances, and get your CFO involved in that. It was our CFO that caught that issue. They did the calculations, say, "Wait a second, this word here is going to be a real problem for us." All right, and finally, and I hate to bring this up, but there are tools of desperation. Sometimes you're just desperate. There are no other options. And there are things you can do that will save your organization. And I know some of you have seen these. And desperation, I think that's really the right word here. It can save your organization, and it should be the last resort after you've exhausted everything else. And just like with reserve funds, if you're going to have to keep going back to tools of desperation for more than 18 months, there's a bigger issue here, and you could be on the path to insolvency. But let's talk about what some of these things are. So in emergencies, borrowing from an endowment, it's definitely possible, and it's extremely dangerous. In my mind, you should only borrow from an endowment if there is a very clear, identifiable event in the future that will lead to its repayment. If you don't know how you will repay it, do not borrow from your endowment. The endowment can outlast your organization and should. You're causing permanent damage when you're reducing that size. Permanently repurposing endowment gifts, existing or pledged. That's another powerful tool, and it works. It's allowable. All you have to do is go back to that original donor and ask for their permission and make the case for why it would be better for their gift to go towards a current need than the endowment. But understand the cost. You're taking an asset that could deliver value in perpetuity and blowing it all in 1 year. You'll never get it back. So again, I think this is something to be done only in extreme cases. But it is there. If the alternative is going out of business or going to a donor who has a pledge due, or even going to an existing endowment donor and saying, "Can we take your endowment and permanently reclassify it to get us to become our bridge fund for this crisis?" It's a tool. Dangerous, but it can work. Similarly, borrowing. You can borrow, but you better have a way to pay it back and a plan for paying it back. So approach with caution. And then there's sale of assets. That's a little safer, particularly if we're talking about excess assets. Selling assets or sale leaseback could deliver a cash infusion. Sale leaseback is if you sell the property you own to someone that will lease it to you. Obviously it's creating a long-term burden, but that might get you through that crisis. Approach with caution, but these are viable tools. And again, I hope you never have to use these things, but they are there. Happy to take any comments on things that others have done beyond what's on this page? And again, I can open it up if there's if anyone wants to jump into the conversation or add anything into the chat. Not seeing that, we'll move on to our final section, pitfalls. I think we'll go through this pretty quickly because I talked about a lot of them as we went along, but I do just want to share a couple of cautionary notes. To me, the biggest blinder, and one we have to be really aware of in what's going on right now. Okay, we can go back to that very first slide where you listed all the change, is not realizing that this change is permanent. Knowing that something is not temporary is a huge pitfall to be tricked into thinking we just need to wait out the economy. I'm seeing that even now in performing arts. Some of my peers are saying we just need audiences to come back. They're not coming back. Audience behavior has permanently changed. We need to change our strategy to work for the way audiences behave today. Similarly, is institutionalizing crisis. And we talked a little bit about this when we talked about the bridge funds, the organizations that every year are doing emergency year-end campaigns to the same donors. That's a huge pitfall there. Underestimating the magnitude of a crisis, it's kind of obvious. But also, so is the temptation, on the other hand, to cause permanent damage in what should be a temporary situation. So using those desperation techniques when there was another way to get there. Again, borrowing from the endowment or raiding the endowment fund. If you're in a temporary situation, there's other things you could do. I'd much rather do a bridge fund or take some short-term pain. When you raid your endowment, that has long-term implications. So, same thing with laying off staff that you're going to need post-crisis. I think a lot of organizations got surprised after COVID. They really made their organizations efficient. But then when COVID ended, they had no institutional memory, and it took a long time to rebuild the organization, right? So be careful about the permanent damage. The death spiral, I made a mention of that earlier, but that's cutting expenses to the point that you've hurt value, which then hurts revenue, which then hurts value, and getting into this spiral of cutting yourself into oblivion. Organizations can't cut their way to success. You really need to grow top line to get there. Not communicating the vision. This is essential for staff morale. It's essential for donors. You need to make sure you take the time to explain what will happen when this crisis is over and how you get through that. And that helps avoid acting desperate. I think I saw some more comment. Oh, it was just another organization. Okay, great. So how do we protect ourselves from that? From all these pitfalls? Well, I'll get back to the point I made at the very beginning. A strong strategic plan is your protection. Use it, over communicate it, and if nothing else, take that from today, that strategic plan is that guide that can help you. And then there's a few other ideas. I've discussed these, but just want to reinforce them. Prioritizing value creation, doing scenario planning, business planning for post-crisis, not taking your funders or your staff for granted, and over-communicating vision. So that's the formal part of the presentation. I'm going to take off the sharing, and I'd be happy to take any questions, comments, rebuttals, heckles, whatever we like. But we can have an open conversation now. So just raise your hand if you'd like to jump in. And we can go back to some of the prompts. Is there anything you're worried about today that you want to discuss?
Hey, Warren,
Yep.
what's the best way for an organization to engage this work? It sounds daunting, it takes a lot of time. I guess the question is, how did you start at NJPAC? And was it a small group of people? How do you start? I think that's the challenge with some of these things is it's very big. How do you begin?
How do you begin dealing with the rescue
Yeah, how do
plan?
you how do you begin with, should I do the mission matrix first, or should I,
Um,
you know, do an alternative plan, or should I do the whole thing is there's 12 things you could do. How did you maybe organize it at NJPAC?
sure. Well, I think my first comment would be that there should always be a current strategic plan. And if there's not, um, ideally you're doing this when you're not in crisis, but I think it's well worth the time to create the strategic plan. Now, obviously, if the wheels are falling off the bus, I mean, COVID, we had 48 hours to redesign our business model. We're not going to create a strategic plan at that particular moment. Um, I think I would start by asking, if you're in crisis, start by asking, what is the change that we're facing, right? Is this something short term? Is there a path on the other side, or is this a broader change in our business model? Um, and I think that becomes the guide point. But I think after a strategic plan, the next thing I would do would be a business plan that outlives the crisis, right? What does success look like? And then what do we need to do to get there?
And how many people were in your core group to navigate this? Was it
So
like you, the CFO, and a few other people, or
sure. So I mean, I've been through enough crises. I can give some different examples. COVID, we had a week or so to figure things out. That was a pretty small group. That was the CEO, the CFO, the COO, and our business analyst, and we started with scenario planning, um, and um, agreed on. Actually, the HR person was in that too. We agreed to kind of some short-term principles, and our goal was within 24 hours to be able to have a statement to staff. And the statement to staff was very reassuring. It was like, okay, we are fine for 30 days. We, and during that 30 days, we're going to figure out our long-term plan. So, everyone's got a job still. You're going to be remote as of tomorrow, and we're going to figure it out. Give us a minute, but we're here for 30 days. We're committing to that. And then we built out the business plan. And we kind of continue. We had weekly conversations with all of our staff, laying out, okay, here's where we're at. This is when we're going to tell you what happens next. And we were very clear to meet those criteria each time. I'll contrast that with the longer term issue I'd mentioned earlier about the organization that had to create that vision fund, that 5-year bridge fund. That was a much longer process, right? And that was really a board question. The board challenged the new CEO and said, "We have an unsustainable business model. You've got 60 days to come back to us with a plan." And that plan then, was a strategic plan was a business plan that was built on the strategic plan principles. And 60 days, and this was working with the senior management team, came back and delivered to the board. Here's our plan for the future. If you endorse it, we are going to raise this bridge fund. But again, there was a luxury of time there. They weren't about to go out of business, but obviously they had to make a change because they were on an unsustainable path. So I think knowing kind of what timing you've got to work with changes the way you act. But in all of these, it's long-term plan and communication around that vision and decisive, clear action.
Hey Warren, I'm Dave Lawson.
I
I'm
did.
also with FEI Boston.
Great.
Thanks a lot for this presentation. I feel like I'm going to get the slides and I want to send a few of them over to a couple executive directors and board members that I have. In particular, I have one client who probably, no names mentioned, has the worst board I've ever seen in my life. And they're somewhat addicted to going into their endowment. So it's sort of like, maybe this is like a little start I can give them to give them a little tweak to kind of heard it from a different voice, except other than from me. Um, but it's very interesting. This one client is just, never seen anything like it. They have a board member who basically is the board.
Oh,
And
that's concerning.
the governance is ridiculous, but he's controlling sort of the future. And it's kind of a point, if it was me anybody would listen to me from that board level, I would just say, we need a new board. We need a board of functioning people and specific roles. And this type of board that I'm dealing with is pretty much made up, I don't want to say friends and family, but it's pretty close to that. And it's not really run as a nonprofit. It's sort of run as a club or something. And kind of something I'm wrestling with. And it's kind of a lot of what you said kind of really hit home because I'm seeing it in real time. So thank you for your insight.
Yeah, I mean, look on the digging into endowment. It's certainly concerning. Yeah, I'll just really quickly. I think it's important that anyone who has an endowment is familiar with the law on endowment. Endowments are permanently restricted, and by definition need to exist for long-term value creation and long-term spending power. Again, you can borrow, but rating the endowment, there's very few situations in which that really passes muster. And ultimately, that's not why donors gave it, right? And if you have a track record of that, you're not going to get future gifts to your endowment. Endowments are incredibly powerful, but the whole idea is that they are a source of spending on the investment earnings, not use of the principal. And again, there are ways you can do it. You can ask donors for permission, but I think it's really, really dangerous. You'll never get that money back, and often that's generational money that was from an estate gift intended to create generational value to the community. So I think it's really scary when that's used inappropriately.
Yeah, it's a good point. And the other thing that's probably very interesting, the last, couple of years or so, we've had a good run on the stock market, and it's sort of masked some of the, shenanigans that are going on with it. So
Mhm.
if the stock market was dropping, it would be like a flashing red light, theoretically, to a lot of the people on the board. But I think this market has been pretty good, and it covers up some of these sins. So kind
That's
of
true. I
interesting
mean,
times.
a real best practice with endowment spending is to have a look back period for your spending policy that gets you through a full investment cycle. So, I mean, I would argue going back 5 years is really powerful. And that allows you to keep that spending up when the market goes down, but also keeps you from going crazy when the market goes up.
Thanks.
Happy to take any other questions. Oh, I think,
Warren, I'll just chime in again. And I'm working with several people that are on the call. I have worked with them, and an actively engaged board is essential for success. Dave, I think you outlined it very well. If you don't have the right board and they're not engaged in a very positive way, you're basically just pushing the rock up the hill. Very, very
yeah.
difficult. Helping a couple organizations, and the board, one board is just, they're active, but they never engage in the activities. They may not engage in the fundraising. So this is a one employee nonprofit. It all falls onto this one person to drive everything. And I try to, like Dave, I try to help, but it doesn't work. You can't do it. One person can't drive it all.
Yeah.
Yeah, John, I mean, in reality, I could write a case study on this, what I'm dealing with right now, and probably send it off to a few of these graduate schools and say, yeah, this is really true. It's not made up. It's not fiction. It's the real thing. And I've never seen anything like it. And even during this call, I got a call from one of the, which I did not answer, by the way, a call from one of the board members, this board member from hell, who I call. And he's just like, I need this, I need that. I've never seen like this one person so involved in all the tentacles of the organization from day to day. And, his strategic function is really fundraising. and he's kind of come up short on that area as well. So, anyways, when I
There's a
write my
good, there's
case
a,
story, I have a good client to do it on.
Abby asked a really good question. What tools or methods would you recommend for determining when and how aggressively to react to an existential threat, one that may impact you, but you can't be sure if or when? And gave the example of the trickle-down effect of DEI funding being threatened on a national level. And I mean, that's a great question and a very current one. Certainly in my sector, um, the NEA has started kind of floating out that they may refuse to fund organizations that have active DEI policies. They backed off a little bit. They've changed that to say, okay, we won't fund DEI related projects, but your organization can still have DEI policies. But it's a really interesting question, right? We are at risk right now of quick existential threats in Washington. So the tools I would recommend, I think the most important thing if facing something like this is to go back to the question of what's our purpose. Um, if we have to change the way we do things, ultimately, what is our goal? And the clearer and more succinct we can be in the goal as opposed to the methods. So, if our goal is to provide to ensure that we have a safe world for LGBT youth, great goal, right? And we're concerned that any kind of government funding may be threatened, or the way we get our money today may be threatened because of changes that are happening in Washington or change in the national discourse on DEI. I'd go back to the question of, okay, well, what does a safe world for LGBT youth look like? What are the conditions that we're striving to reach here? Are there other ways we can get to this problem? So even if our exact methods are going to change, right, the problem is still there. And if we're clear about what that problem is, that opens up more options. So you might then say, okay, what are we good at? And what's the problem we're trying to solve? And then what has changed? Knowing what has changed, how are we creating value? Who else sees value, right? If the government's not going to be a funder, who else benefits beyond the federal government because of this work we're doing with LGBT youth? It might be major companies and employers, or it might be families. But those are the kinds of questions I think to ask for. And again, I'm giving kind of and I know that doesn't entirely answer Abby's really difficult and tough question here. But I think that's the starting point. How do we create value? What are we good at? And what's the problem we're trying to solve? Certainly, in an existential question, we may have to throw out, this is the way we actually achieve that value. But the goal shouldn't change, right? The goal is still, in my example, creating a safe world for LGBT youth. I hope that helps, Abby. I don't know if you want to add anything to that. It's a really tough and current question for sure.
That was great. Thank you.
Are there any other questions? And I'll give you back 9 minutes of your time. You can reach out through John if you want to talk one-on-one after as well. I'm happy to chat with anyone, and appreciate you spending an hour and 20 minutes with me today. Oh, I see one message coming in. Oh, thank you. Okay, great. You're welcome. John, do you want to answer the question about the recording?
Yeah, I mean, the recording is going to be available. We're going to send out a note after the webinar is over with a short survey, and then we'll have access to the recording link and the PowerPoint. It's more information about how you can talk to us about having little fireside chats or whatever about things that are going on for you. Yeah, Abby, I wanted to ask you, is the Berkshire Pulse all digital or is it digital in print?
Um, uh, no, nothing. We're in person. Uh,
Oh,
Dan
I
said
thought
print.
somehow it was maybe there's another digital
May-
thing in the Berkshires.
Berkshire Edge is one of our
Yeah,
outlets,
yeah, okay.
maybe. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, okay, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Very good. Thank you. All right.
Thank you very much, everyone. Appreciate your time. Hope you found it useful and good luck navigating a really interesting time.
Thank you.